people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fucking fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
To the motherfucking relay, we're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, and now it's time for our weekend recap. The French on Cruz versus Savannah Marshall super middleweight title fight for the undisputed crown. The fight worked out more or less as I predicted, as I expected. I went with Savannah Marshall to win on points. French on Cruz being a durable fighter, a tough and strong fighter. I didn't figure this fight would end in a knockout, but I figured
Savannah would have her hand raised. Let's talk about what we saw.
the judges themselves, the judges had the fight a lot closer than I did. I could only give French on Cruz maybe 1 or 2 rounds. The first round and perhaps the 7th.
In the opening round, she came out hard and fast. Looked like she was flustering Savannah Marshall, forcing her to give up ground, try to create space.
Gave that round to French on Cruz on aggressiveness and activity, being the ring general, but by round 2, Savannah Marshall found her range, composed herself, and started landing punches. And that really is the story of the fight, that most of the clean work and the clean punches was coming from Savannah, whereas what you got from Franchon was a fighter that couldn't manage the distance and was regularly overshooting it.
The jab of Savannah Marshall.
Savannah fighting at a slight crouch, bending at the knees, bending at the waist, coming in at a slight angle to keep her head off center and out of the way of any
Right hands.
The looping right hand is a punch that French on Cruz normally has a lot of success with, but in this fight, Savannah fighting at a slight angle and coming in at one, it made it hard for Franchon to land that punch because Savannah could then just roll and counter.
Roll it off the shoulder and bring something over.
Savannah Marshall, who was clearly winning the battle of the jabs, as stated. In the first round, she seemed a little bit flustered by Franchon, but gained her composure in the second and started regularly landing jabs.
Hard ones.
Not saying that the fight wasn't scrappy, that the fight wasn't messy, because it was. Franchon Cruz oftentimes lunging in, off balance, stumbling around, but whenever clean punches got landed, more often than not, it was Savannah Marshall, and it was off the jab.
Jab in the straight, snapping French on Cruz's head back.
That was the trial for Franchon, trying to find a way around Savannah Marshall's lead hand. Whenever there was enough space between them to get off punches, Savannah was landing.
Savannah, who had the height advantage, the reach advantage, not needing to be close to Franchon to touch her with punches. This is something that Franchon struggled with.
Yeah.
Thus, she resorted to smothering.
Rushing Savannah, trying for punches that didn't land, and falling in. Being too close to Savannah Marshall to land any effective punches, that resulted in more clinches and wrestling than anything else, and that really was the story of the fight, that one of these fighters...
One of them is boxing and one of them is wrestling.
I saw French on Cruz lose her footing at least 2, maybe 3 times throughout the course of this fight, lose her footing.
Ahead of the fight, I told you that Savannah Marshall is the more balanced fighter of the two, more athletic fighter as well.
French on Cruz at her very best is coming forward, throwing punches and bunches, which was quite difficult in this fight because she was getting nailed with jabs on the way in, jab in the straight.
Unable to win the battle of the jabs.
Not landing much in terms of effective hooks, mid-range to inside.
Oftentimes just wrestling and pushing Savannah around instead.
When the judges' scorecards were read, at least one of them had the fight scored a draw. I couldn't wrap my mind around that at the time. I still can't.
No way.
Most I saw Franchon win was 1, maybe 2 rounds. Looked like a 9-1 to 8-2 kind of fight for me. 8-2 in favor of Savannah Marshall.
Franchon was plenty aggressive at the start, but Savannah effectively fought her off and backed her off in spots throughout the second half of the fight, stepping into the jab,
bringing over the straight, visibly hurting Franchon Cruz, who
was tired,
wearing Savannah's handiwork on her face, busted lip and a busted nose.
I said it ahead of the fight. I said, I think Franchon Cruz is underestimating Savannah Marshall. Having been in attendance for the Shields fight, she's telling herself that if Clarissa can beat her, then surely I can too. And Franchon Cruz ain't Clarissa Shields.
She's not as coordinated a fighter as Clarissa Shields, not as athletic, doesn't have her balance or her speed, her hand speed.
You can say whatever the hell you want to say at the press conference and make it sound good in the ring.
The outcome of this fight would not be decided by who raises the most valid talking points at a press conference. Ultimately, it's what happens in the ring that would decide.
All that talking over each other.
I still don't understand why Franchon Cruz decided to play the poor me angle when this was a title shot that she voluntarily gave to Savannah Marshall, saying that Savannah didn't deserve it, but she was the one giving it to her.
Didn't make any goddamn sense.
When I said that Savannah spent more time in the pocket with Franchon than I expected Savannah to regularly create more space, but Franchon, she is a hard fighter to work around, constantly coming forward, attempting to apply pressure, but walking into jabs in the process, at least in this fight.
Jab was Savannah's most effective punch in this fight.
Good fight, albeit a messy one while it lasted. The prediction stuck, and Savannah Marshall is the new undisputed champion at 168 pounds.
Congratulations.
Men's heavyweight news, the main event of the Top Rank show yesterday, Jared Anderson
Scraping by former IBF champion Charles Martin, saying, I wanted to go the distance. Charles Martin had power until the last round.
I want to start off by saying that now is not the time to sell your stock in Jared Anderson. Just because he looked a little bit more human yesterday than he normally does, that doesn't mean you should throw the whole fighter away.
Let's not be overly dramatic here.
I wanted to go the distance. It was my first time. I just wanted to make sure that I could go the distance and especially be able to withstand the power the whole 10 rounds. He had power until the last round, and I was happy to get the rounds in. I think I took his best shots well. I don't think there was a time in the fight where I looked unsteady or where I couldn't hold my own. Did I feel he got me with a good shot and stunned me? No, but I do feel he got me with a good shot and made me aware. Yes, so I had to readjust and get back to the game plan.
I can't tell Jared Anderson how he did or didn't feel receiving those punches. I can only tell you what I saw from the outside looking in. And to many, round 5, Charles Martin looked to have had Jared Anderson in trouble. At least it looked that way.
As stated, I can't tell Jared Anderson how he felt in those moments. I can only tell you that in round 5, as Charles Martin, who fights out of the southpaw stance, was getting off those backhands, those straight left hands, he buckled Jared Anderson. You could see him bend at the knees. You could see his head snap back. You could see he was walking into some very hard punches, and he didn't look to be wearing them well.
His knees buckled.
This is a much older Charles Martin than the Charles Martin that Anthony Joshua faced many, many years ago, then unbeaten Charles Martin, who was reigning IBF champion. And since then, no one has handled Charles or dispatched him quite as easily as Anthony Joshua, who's subject to a lot of criticism, an unappreciated fighter, I think.
Nobody else has done to Charles Martin what Anthony Joshua did to Charles Martin in just 2 rounds. He beat him easy.
I mean, really think about that. Adam Kovnowski, Luis Ortiz, more recently Jared Anderson. These fighters struggled with Charles Martin, whereas Anthony Joshua took him out and did it quick.
But he gets more criticism than any other heavyweight out there.
It's become common practice to tear Anthony Joshua down as other fighters struggle with the same fighters that he beat easy. I think that's a testament to just how good Anthony Joshua is and how underrated, underappreciated he is. Better still, Jared Anderson shared the ring with Charles Martin yesterday, and he didn't do to Charles what Anthony did to Charles.
He struggled.
Jared Anderson, who I still think is a promising young heavyweight, lots of ability and athleticism, but there is a trade-off.
I'm not selling my stock just yet. I still think Jared has a bright future, but it doesn't get said often enough that Jared Anderson is on the smaller end of the spectrum as far as heavyweights go. Heavyweights today, that he's not as physically imposing as an Anthony Joshua, a Deontay Wilder, a Tyson Fury,
a Felipe Hergovic, a Zhilei Zhang, a Joe Joyce, that he is nowhere near as physically imposing as these fighters. He ain't got the same kind of frame they got.
Jared Anderson was in action in April of this year, before this past weekend, opposite the ring, the Dominican Republic's own George Arias. A smaller, stumpier, heavy-set fighter.
A heavyweight, still very much a heavyweight, but a smaller fighter in terms of height and length than Jared Anderson. And in that fight, I noticed that Jared Anderson likes to pull back in straight lines.
You'd see George Arias try for big shots, looping shots, and Jared Anderson would pull back in a straight line. He was able to get away with that with George Arias because George ain't a taller, longer fighter like, say, a Charles Martin.
You know that immediately after the fight, I said that that was something that needed tending to, that Jared Anderson can't keep doing that as he steps up in class and faces more physically imposing fighters with more height and more length, more reach. Pulling back in a straight line could see him eating straight shots.
Shifting his weight to his back foot and backpedaling in a straight line.
He's leaving himself open for backhands, and we saw that yesterday in the Charles Martin fight, particularly in the 5th round. He ate a lot of backhands.
And he didn't take them well.
In spite of how he says he felt, outside looking in, he looked like he was on his way to being knocked out. Looked like he was on queer streak. Throughout the course of the fight, it was established that, in spite of Jared Anderson landing more punches, jabs in particular, mostly jabs,
And he was busy with the jab, effective with the jab.
Charles Martin was the bigger puncher of the two, and that was established, that Charles Martin, if he can land, he can really hurt Jared Anderson. You go in there with a Charles Martin, a former champion who's been around the block, and it becomes a case of who did it better, Jared Anderson versus other fighters that have fought this fighter, other fighters that have beat this fighter, perhaps in better fashion than Jared Anderson.
Certainly.
Charles Martin was the bigger fighter and the bigger puncher. That's what I saw.
It's the trade-off when it comes to being a somewhat smaller fighter at heavyweight today. You may have more speed, more snap in your punches, better coordination, and better balance than some of these lumbering lummoxes, but you're not as big a puncher as they are.
Perhaps not as durable. Charles Martin did eat a lot of shots, jabs in particular, but he wore them well. He seldom ever looked hurt by anything that...
Jared Anderson did score an early knockdown off a right hand, a flash knockdown. Charles wasn't actually hurt by it. He popped right back up.
Didn't look to be on queer street, standing on unsteady legs. He shook it off and got back in the fight.
The takeaway.
Jared Anderson is on the smaller end of the spectrum in today's heavyweight division. That has certain advantages and disadvantages. That coming forward, he can make himself a very tricky target for some of these lumbering lummoxes. But shifting his weight onto his back foot and pulling back, he becomes vulnerable. He can't fight most of these fights from the outside because he's smaller than these guys.
Now coming forward.
He can hunker down and fight at a slight crouch, slip past the straight punches and bring over counters, side to side like a metronome. He can be tricky coming forward, but moving backwards.
He's a sitting duck.
He's got some things he needs to work on, put simply.
As stated, I don't think now is the time to sell all of your Jared Anderson stock. I'm not proposing that because he looked human yesterday, you got to throw the whole fighter away. That's drastic.
It's actually good that he got that wake-up call with Charles Martin, seeing what else the division has to offer, going the distance and banking those rounds.
It's easy to develop a false sense of confidence when you're knocking over stiffs in succession. See Edgar Berlanga.
Might get the feeling that you're invincible and nobody can touch you. Well, yesterday, Charles Martin was touching Jared Anderson and he didn't like it. He doesn't want to keep going through that. He's got to tidy things up.
That fight was a lot more harrowing for Jared than I thought it would be.
But he weathered the storm, powered through it, and secured the W, even if he looked human in the process of doing so.
All in a day's work.
And just in keeping with the theme of all things heavyweight, former WBC champion Deontay Wilder on Usyk says, "That man is terrified of me. He's dodged me so many times. He's been offered a lot of money to fight me, many times, but he's denied it. They said they do not want bomb squad problems."
Bullshit.
From the moment that Alexander Usyk beat Anthony Joshua for the second time last year, the focus then shifted to a Fury fight.
The undisputed title fight.
And that started all the way back there last year, going into this one. And when the fight fell apart this year, the focus immediately shifted to a Daniel Dubois fight because Daniel's his mandatory challenger. That's not a handpick.
He's got to fight him.
He's next in the rotation, and he is due a title shot, whether Deontay Wilder likes it or not. The time frame for these supposed offers that Usyk was made to fight Deontay Wilder, even if they were made,
I'm going to assume that the offers were made after the Fury fight fell apart.
in between the time that the Fury fight fell apart and the Daniel Dubois fight was made, I'm going to assume that these offers to fight Deontay, if they were in fact made, were made in between that time, but Usyk's not at liberty to accept them, and that's what Deontay is not saying.
If he were to pursue a fight with Deontay instead of taking care of Daniel, the WBA title would be forfeit.
He's still interested in becoming this division's undisputed champion, so as you can imagine, he doesn't want to just chuck the belts he won in the air. Deontay continued, reference to Andy Ruiz in those negotiations, this is definitely not a 50-50 fight. He's talking about a rematch clause. Either he's drunk or he's on drugs, maybe both. If this deal falls through, you'll never see him again in the boxing scene, especially not on PBC.
Rematch clause.
If Deontay is telling the truth, and Andy Ruiz wanted a two-way rematch clause, that would jeopardize the Anthony Joshua fight in December, the Anthony Joshua fight that Deontay plans on having. So as you can imagine, Deontay's not going to want to give Andy a two-way rematch clause because he wants to be able to move on.
If you give him that rematch clause, you can't move on, and you can't fight Anthony in December.
Don't necessarily agree with Deontay's candor on Alexander Usyk. That stuff just doesn't make make a lot of sense based on the chronology, but when it comes to Andy...
Well, Tyson Fury did say that Andy priced himself out of their fight before the focus shifted back to this one, this fight with Deontay. And what is consistent is that Andy has a lot of demands.
You hear Deontay Wilder's ominous warning that if this fight falls apart, and it has, you won't see Andy in the boxing scene, especially not on PBC. Is that to say that it was the PBC that was going to pay for this? Were they the ones bankrolling this fight? Because I had questions about that. Would it be Skills Challenge that's paying for this, or would it be the PBC?
I think there is something to what Deontay Wilder is saying, because Andy wants to make a lot of money.
You get the sense he wants to be paid the same way he was paid to fight Anthony Joshua 2 times, not realizing Anthony is what made those purses possible, not you.
His marquee value, not yours.
Andy by himself has had 2 box office fights since losing to Anthony Joshua, and both of them were box office flops. Deontay Wilder, he's set to face Anthony Joshua later on this year, saying the fight is definitely going down, and said it may be his next fight if the Ruiz bout can't be agreed, which it isn't.
The PBC don't have any options for Andy, not unless he's willing to fight a high-risk, low-reward guy in Frankie Sanchez or a nobody in Ali Demirezin. I mean, in terms of big heavyweight bouts, there aren't many over there.
No, not at the PBC. So, in order for Andy to fight in a meaningful fight moving forward, if he's not fighting Deontay, he's going to have to expand his horizons.
Broaden them and lower his expectations.
Because nobody, and I mean nobody in the sport of boxing, is in the business of just giving money away. If he wants to get paid, there are some people out there that can make that happen, but he's got to be willing to earn it.
It seems that the fight between Deontay and Andy isn't happening, and the latest is that Deontay will be moving forward with that Anthony Joshua fight, per Deontay Wilder himself and Eddie Hearn, who says that that fight is all but agreed.
Questions that need answers. Who's going to be airing that fight in America? I mean, we know who's paying for it. We know who's bankrolling the show. It's the Prince, it's Skills Challenge, and the good people over there in Saudi. But what about the U.S. rights to the fight and the U.K. rights to the fight? Are we going to be seeing this thing as a DAZN pay-per-view or a Showtime pay-per-view?
What is the role of Showtime and the PBC in Deontay Wilder's career at this point? Are they still doing business, or is he just off doing his own thing?
It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if that's what he were doing, but that is a question that needs an answer, and I'm sure that when the fight is officially announced, many months from now, we will get it.
Still a big fight.
Big show, and what the future holds for Andy Ruiz is uncertain. I mean, if he's looking for a big payday, he's going to need to be in a big fight. He just walked away from another one.
First it was the Fury fight, now it's this fight.
It's looking like he may not even fight, may not fight at all this entire calendar year.
Time is the one thing you don't get back.
Maybe younger than Deontay Wilder, but he really is squandering his time, squandering his best years as a fighter. I mean, Andy's always been known to have a ticker problem.
Motivation.
It's motivating him now. He's not the mandatory to any belts. He's not set to fight in any fights, let alone a big one.
So what's his motivation?
Several years younger than Deontay Wilder. What's driving him? Wilder's got his dance partner for later on this year. What does Andy have?
I vaguely recall hearing the Top Rank was interested in signing him a few weeks ago to match him against their heavyweights.
Got Jared Anderson, who we just talked about. Bakadir Jalalov, they just signed him.
They end up bringing Andy back into the fray.